Hey there, curious minds. Right now, as you're watching this, fishing boats are cruising across the North Sea, their crews completely clueless that beneath their hulls lies an entire lost world. We're talking about a landmass the size of Ireland, with rivers, forests, hills, and thousands of people living their best prehistoric lives. And then one day, gone, swallowed by the waves like it never existed. This is the story of Doggerland, and trust me, it's wilder than any Atlantis myth you've ever heard, because this one is actually real. For thousands of years, this place was basically the Florida of ancient Europe. Great weather, abundant food, prime real estate. Hunter-gatherers were thriving there while your ancestors' ancestors were still figuring out which berries wouldn't kill them. And then the sea came knocking, slowly at first, then all at once, with a tsunami that makes disaster movies look like bathtub splashes. The craziest part: scientists pieced this whole story together from a chunk of peat, some ancient pollen, and oil company surveys. Talk about a detective story. So before we dive into this underwater mystery, smash that like button if you're into lost civilizations and archaeological plot twists, and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from right now? I want to know who's joining me on this journey to a land that literally doesn't exist anymore. Alright, let's get into it. Picture this. It's September 1931, and the world is knee-deep in the Great Depression. Banks are collapsing, breadlines are stretching around city blocks, and most people are too worried about putting food on the table to think about ancient history. Out on the frigid waters of the North Sea, a fishing trawler called the Kalinda is doing what fishing trawlers do, dragging nets across the seafloor, hoping for a decent haul of cod or herring. The crew isn't thinking about archaeology. They're thinking about quotas, weather patterns, and probably what they're going to eat for dinner. Captain Pilgrim Lockwood has been working these waters for years. He knows every current, every sandbank, every spot where the fish like to gather. What he doesn't know, what nobody knows, is that his next catch is about to rewrite the history books. The nets come up heavy that day, which is usually good news. More weight means more fish, and more fish means more money. But when the crew hauls the catch onto the deck, they find something decidedly unfish-like tangled in the mesh. It's a massive chunk of peat, that dark, compressed plant matter you usually find in bogs and wetlands, not floating around 25 miles offshore in the middle of the North Sea. Now, most fishermen would have tossed this soggy mess back overboard without a second thought. Peat isn't exactly valuable cargo, it's essentially prehistoric compost, and nobody's paying good money for that. But something catches Lockwood's eye. Embedded in this waterlogged chunk of ancient earth is an object that definitely doesn't belong there, a barbed point made of antler or bone, clearly shaped by human hands. Let's pause here and appreciate the sheer improbability of this moment. We're talking about a small artifact, maybe the length of your hand, buried inside a chunk of peat, sitting at the bottom of a sea that covers thousands of square miles. The odds of a fishing net snagging this exact piece of seafloor, pulling it up intact and landing it on a deck where someone actually notices the artifact inside? Astronomical doesn't even begin to cover it. If Lockwood had been fishing 50 meters to the left, or if the peat had broken apart on the way up, or if he'd simply dumped it overboard like any sensible fisherman would have done, we might still be completely clueless about what lies beneath the North Sea. Sometimes history pivots on moments of pure dumb luck. Lockwood, to his eternal credit, recognized that this was something unusual. He wasn't an archaeologist or a historian. He was a working fisherman trying to make a living during one of the worst economic disasters in modern history. But he had enough curiosity and common sense to realize that bone tools don't just materialize in the middle of the ocean. So instead of chucking the peat back into the sea, he kept it. He brought it back to port, showed it around, and eventually it made its way into the hands of people who could actually figure out what it meant. The artifact turned out to be a harpoon point, a sophisticated hunting tool designed for catching fish or possibly marine mammals. Analysis showed it was made from red deer antler, carefully carved and barbed to prevent prey from escaping once struck. This wasn't some crude, accidental creation. This was the product of skilled craftsmanship, created by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. And here's where things get really interesting. The peat surrounding the harpoon was dated to approximately 8,000 years ago, give or take a few centuries. 8,000 years. That's older than the Egyptian pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than the earliest known writing systems. When this harpoon was made, Agriculture was still a newfangled invention that most of humanity hadn't gotten around to trying yet. But the real question, the question that made scientists scratch their heads and rethink everything they thought they knew, was devastatingly simple. How did a hunting tool end up 25 miles out to sea? The North Sea isn't exactly shallow in that area. We're talking about waters deep enough that no human could have simply waded out there to do some fishing. And people 8,000 years ago didn't have submarines or scuba gear, unfortunately for them. They couldn't have been hunting from boats in water that deep. Their watercraft technology, while impressive for the time, wasn't exactly equipped for deep-sea expeditions. The tool had clearly been used on land, in the kind of boggy, marshy environment where peat forms, which meant only one thing: the land had to have been there. Where there is now nothing but cold, grey water and the occasional confused fish, there was once solid ground. Ground where people lived, hunted, made tools, and went about their daily lives completely unaware that their entire world would one day vanish beneath the waves. Now, the scientific community's reaction to this discovery was, let's call it measured, which is academic speak for most people completely ignored it. You have to understand the context here. In 1931, the idea of a sunken landmass beneath the North Sea sounded about as credible as claiming you'd found Atlantis in your bathtub. Sure, everyone knew that sea levels had changed over geological time. That was basic science even back then. But a populated, habitable land that had existed within human memory, that had supported communities of people who made sophisticated tools and lived complex lives, that sounded like the plot of a fantasy novel, not serious archaeology. The academic establishment of the 1930s had other things to worry about anyway. The field of archaeology was still sorting out basic questions about human prehistory. Carbon dating hadn't been invented yet, so dating artifacts was more art than science. The study of ancient climates was in its infancy. And frankly, most archaeologists were focused on more glamorous subjects: Egyptian tombs, Greek temples, Roman ruins. A soggy chunk of peat from the bottom of the North Sea didn't exactly set hearts racing in university departments. The Clinder harpoon, as it came to be known, was documented, catalogued, and then largely forgotten. It sat in museum storage while the world moved on to other concerns, like the small matter of another world war. But here's the thing about inconvenient facts. They don't go away just because you ignore them. Throughout the following decades, more evidence kept turning up. Fishermen working the North Sea regularly hauled up strange objects in their nets, not just random bones and rocks, but clearly worked artifacts, stone tools, more bone implements. Animal remains from species that had no business being in the middle of the ocean. Each find was individually easy to dismiss or explain away, but collectively they painted a picture that became harder and harder to ignore. Something had been down there. Someone had been down there. The fishing crews of the North Sea became accidental archaeologists, though most of them probably didn't see it that way. To them, these strange objects were curiosities at best, nuisances at worst. Every bone or stone tool that came up in the nets was something that wasn't fish, and fish were what paid the bills. Many artifacts were simply thrown back, lost forever to the depths they'd come from. Others were kept as souvenirs, displayed on mantelpieces or given to children as toys. A few ended up in local museums, where patient curators tried to make sense of the growing pile of prehistoric objects emerging from the waves. The area that proved most productive for these accidental discoveries was the Doggerland, a large sandbank in the middle of the North Sea that lies between Britain and the European mainland. The Doggerland is relatively shallow compared to the surrounding waters, which made it a prime fishing ground. It also meant that artifacts from the seafloor were more likely to be disturbed and brought up by trawling operations. The bank got its name from medieval Dutch fishing vessels called doggers that worked these waters for centuries, completely unaware that they were sailing over the remains of a lost world. There's something almost poetic about that. Generations of fishermen making their living from the same waters that had swallowed an entire civilization, connected across thousands of years by the simple act of trying to catch dinner. The scientific breakthrough that finally forced the academic world to take the North Sea evidence seriously came from an unexpected direction: pollen. Specifically, the study of ancient pollen preserved in peat and sediment deposits, a field called palynology. In the 1930s and 1940s, a new generation of researchers began developing techniques to identify and date plant species from their microscopic pollen grains. This might sound about as exciting as watching paint dry, but it turned out to be revolutionary for understanding the past. Pollen is incredibly durable. It can survive for thousands of years under the right conditions, preserving a record of what plants grew in a particular place at a particular time. And since different plant communities thrive in different climates and environments, analysing pollen sequences can tell you what the landscape looked like throughout history. When researchers applied these techniques to peat samples from the North Sea floor, the results were stunning. The pollen told a story of forests, oak, elm, hazel, pine, covering land that was now underwater. It described marshes and wetlands teeming with reeds and water plants. It revealed a landscape that would have been perfectly comfortable for human habitation, rich in resources and sheltered from the worst extremes of the post-glacial climate. This wasn't just speculation anymore. This was hard, physical evidence that the North Sea basin had once been dry land and had remained that way long enough for complex ecosystems to develop. The peat itself was proof. Peat only forms in boggy, waterlogged conditions on land. You don't get peat forming at the bottom of a sea. The Kalinda harpoon suddenly didn't look so crazy anymore. If there had been forests and marshes where the North Sea now rolled, then of course there could have been people living there. Of course they would have made tools and hunted game and built lives for themselves. The artifact wasn't an anomaly to be explained away. It was a window into a world that science was only beginning to understand. The question was no longer whether this lost land had existed. The question was how big it had been, how long it had lasted, and what had happened to the people who called it home. Throughout the mid-20th century, evidence continued to accumulate. Improved dating techniques confirmed that the North Sea basin had been inhabited during the Mesolithic period, roughly from 12,000 to 6,000 years ago. This was the era between the last ice age and the advent of farming, a time when humanity lived as hunter-gatherers, following the seasons and the migrations of game animals. The people of this era didn't build permanent monuments or write down their histories. They left behind tools, bones, and the faint traces of their camps, and then they moved on. Understanding their world requires patience, detective work, and a willingness to piece together a puzzle from fragments that were never meant to survive. The North Sea continued to yield its treasures. In 1988, a trawler working near the Doggerbank pulled up a human skull, the remains of someone who had lived and died on land that no longer existed. Analysis suggested the individual was male, probably middle-aged, and had lived around 8,000 years ago. Other human remains followed over the years, each one a silent witness to a forgotten way of life. These weren't just artifacts. These were people who had families, who told stories around fires, who looked up at the same stars we see today and probably wondered about their place in the universe. The fact that their entire world now lies beneath 50 feet of seawater doesn't make them any less real. By the late 20th century, the scientific community had fully accepted the existence of this drowned landscape. What had once seemed like fantasy was now established fact, supported by multiple lines of evidence from geology, archaeology, biology, and climate science. The land beneath the North Sea had a name waiting for it, a name that would transform it from an abstract concept into a place as real as Britain or Denmark or any other location on a modern map. But that christening, and the revolution in understanding that came with it, would have to wait for a visionary researcher willing to think differently about the past. The scattered pieces of the puzzle were all there. Someone just needed to put them together. What makes the story of the Kalinda harpoon so compelling isn't just the artifact itself, it's what it represents about the nature of discovery. Captain Lockwood wasn't looking for evidence of a lost civilization. He was just trying to catch fish. The scientists who eventually studied his find weren't initially trying to prove anything about sunken lands. They were just following the evidence where it led. Great discoveries often happen this way, not through deliberate searching, but through accidents, coincidences, and the willingness of curious people to ask, what if? The North Sea kept its secrets for thousands of years, but once it started talking, it had a lot to say. The fishing communities of the North Sea region still pull strange objects from the depths today. Most of these finds will never make it into academic journals or museum displays. They'll end up as curiosities, conversation pieces, reminders that the seafloor holds memories far older than any human civilization currently standing. Every bone tool, every worked stone, every fragment of ancient wood is a message from a world we're only beginning to understand. The Kalinda harpoon was just the first word in a very long conversation. A conversation about how landscapes change, how climates shift, and how human communities adapt or perish in the face of forces far beyond their control. It started with a fisherman who was curious enough to keep what he found instead of throwing it back. Sometimes that's all it takes to change our understanding of history. But here's the twist. The Kalinda harpoon wasn't actually the first clue that something strange was going on beneath the North Sea. Decades before Captain Lockwood hauled up his famous chunk of peat, another man had already figured out the basic outline of the mystery. He just had the misfortune of being right at exactly the wrong time, which in science is sometimes worse than being wrong altogether. His name was Clement Reid, and he was the kind of Victorian-era naturalist that doesn't really exist anymore. Part botanist, part geologist, part beachcomber extraordinaire. Reid spent years wandering the coastlines of Britain, particularly the storm-battered shores of Norfolk, studying everything from ancient seeds to submerged forests. And it was those submerged forests that would consume his imagination and eventually lead him to a conclusion so radical that the scientific establishment essentially pretended he didn't exist. The Norfolk coast has a peculiar feature that locals have known about for centuries. During exceptionally low tides, particularly after winter storms have scoured away the beach sand, something eerie emerges from the water: tree stumps. Hundreds of them, blackened and worn by millennia of saltwater exposure, but unmistakably the remains of an ancient forest. Roots still anchored in the clay beneath, trunks broken off at roughly the same height as if some giant had mowed them all down with a cosmic lawnmower. The effect is genuinely unsettling. Imagine walking along a beach and suddenly finding yourself in the middle of a petrified woodland that shouldn't exist. Local fishing communities had their own explanation for these ghostly stumps, and it was about as scientific as you'd expect from people who thought thunder was God rearranging his furniture. They called them Noah's Woods, the remains of the forest that had existed before the biblical flood swept across the earth. In their minds, these stumps were proof that the good book was literally true, that a divine deluge had once covered everything, and that they were walking on the drowned remnants of the antediluvian world. It was a tidy explanation that required zero actual investigation and conveniently confirmed what everyone already believed. The perfect Victorian folk tale, really. Clement Reid was not satisfied with folk tales. He looked at those stumps and saw something that required actual explanation. Not supernatural intervention, but natural processes operating over timescales that most people couldn't even imagine. Reid began systematically studying the submerged forests, cataloguing the species of trees represented, analysing the sediments surrounding them, and mapping their extent along the coastline. What he found was remarkable. These weren't random patches of drowned woodland. They were part of a consistent pattern that extended far beyond what was visible at low tide. The forest continued out under the waves, getting progressively older and deeper as you moved away from shore. Reid's great intellectual leap came when he connected the dots. If submerged forests existed along the British coast, and if similar forests had been reported by fishermen operating far out in the North Sea, then logically, there must have been a time when all that area was dry land. Not a sudden flood that drowned everything at once, but a gradual rise in sea level that slowly inundated a vast lowland region. The implications were staggering. Reid calculated that the area involved wasn't some minor coastal strip. It was an enormous expanse of territory, potentially connecting Britain to mainland Europe and extending far into what was now open ocean. In 1913, Reid published his findings in a book called Submerged Forests. It was a careful, methodical work, filled with detailed observations and logical deductions. Reid proposed that during the last ice age, when enormous amounts of water were locked up in continental glaciers, sea levels had been dramatically lower. The North Sea basin had been dry land, a rolling plain of forests, rivers and wetlands where both animals and humans could have lived. As the ice melted and the seas rose, this land had been gradually swallowed by the advancing waters, leaving only the ghostly stumps and occasional artifacts as evidence of its existence. This was, in retrospect, almost completely correct. Reid had essentially figured out the basic story of what we now call Doggerland using nothing but careful observation, logical reasoning, and a willingness to follow the evidence wherever it led. He deserved a medal. He deserved a standing ovation from the scientific community. He deserved, at minimum, to have people take his ideas seriously and investigate them further. What he got instead was the academic equivalent of a polite cough and a change of subject. Reed's book was largely ignored by the scientific establishment. Partly this was bad timing. 1913 was not an ideal year to be publishing revolutionary ideas about prehistory, what with a world war about to kick off and rather thoroughly distract everyone. But mostly it was because Reed's conclusions were simply too radical for his contemporaries to accept. The idea of a vast inhabited landmass beneath the North Sea sounded too much like Atlantis, too much like legend dressed up as science. Serious geologists and archaeologists had careers to protect, and endorsing what sounded like a fantasy wasn't going to help anyone get tenure. Reed died in 1916, just 3 years after publishing his masterwork, never knowing that future generations would prove him right. His book gathered dust on library shelves, occasionally cited in footnotes, but never given the attention it deserved. The submerged forests continued to emerge at low tide, and fishermen continued to occasionally haul up strange objects from the deep. But the connection between these phenomena remained largely unexplored. It would take another generation of scientists armed with new tools and techniques to pick up where Reed had left off. The tragedy of Clement Reed is a reminder that being ahead of your time is often a curse rather than a blessing. He saw further than his contemporaries, but he couldn't make them see what he saw. His careful observations and logical deductions were dismissed as speculation because they didn't fit the prevailing assumptions of his era. Science likes to think of itself as a purely rational enterprise where evidence wins out over prejudice, but the reality is messier. Ideas need champions, and sometimes the champion dies before the battle is won. The tools that would eventually vindicate Clement Reed came from an unexpected source, the obsessive study of something most people wouldn't look at twice: pollen. Those microscopic grains that make your eyes water in spring and your nose run like a faucet. It turns out that this seasonal nuisance is also one of the most powerful time machines science has ever discovered, and a new generation of researchers was about to use it to unlock the secrets of the drowned world beneath the North Sea. The science is called palynology, which sounds like something you'd need a PhD just to pronounce correctly, but the basic principle is elegantly simple. Every plant species produces pollen with a distinctive shape and structure. You can identify an oak from a pine from a hazel just by looking at their pollen grains under a microscope. And here's the crucial part. Pollen is incredibly durable. The outer coating of a pollen grain is made of a substance called sporopollenin, which is essentially nature's version of indestructible plastic. Under the right conditions, particularly in waterlogged, oxygen-poor environments like peat bogs, pollen can survive for tens of thousands of years without degrading. This means that every layer of peat is essentially a frozen snapshot of what was growing in the area when that layer formed. Dig down through a peat deposit and analyze the pollen at each level, and you can reconstruct the changing vegetation over millennia. More forests at one level, more grassland at another, the arrival of new species, the disappearance of old ones. Climate shifts, human impacts, ecological transformations, it's all recorded in the pollen, waiting to be read by anyone patient enough to do the counting. The pioneers who brought this technique to bear on the North Sea mystery were a formidable trio. Graham Clark was a young archaeologist at Cambridge, brilliant and ambitious, determined to understand the lives of prehistoric hunter-gatherers in ways that previous generations had never attempted. He wasn't content with just digging up artifacts and putting them in display cases. He wanted to know what the landscape looked like, what people ate, how they moved through their environment, what their world actually felt like to live in. This was revolutionary thinking for the 1930s, when archaeology was still largely focused on spectacular finds and impressive ruins rather than ecological reconstruction. Clark's secret weapons were Harry and Margaret Godwin, a husband and wife team of botanists who had developed expertise in pollen analysis that was unmatched in Britain. The Godwins had spent years perfecting techniques for extracting, identifying and counting ancient pollen grains, building up reference collections and developing statistical methods for interpreting the results. They were the kind of meticulous, detail-oriented researchers who could spend months staring through a microscope at tiny specks and somehow find it fascinating. Science needs people like this, the patient counters, the careful cataloguers, the ones willing to do the tedious groundwork that makes breakthroughs possible. When Clark and the Godwins turned their attention to peat samples from the North Sea floor, they found exactly what Clement Reed had predicted decades earlier. The pollen told a story of a living, breathing landscape, not the barren seafloor that existed today, but a complex mosaic of forests and wetlands. Pine trees had grown there first, colonizing the bare ground left by retreating glaciers. Then came birch, hazel, and eventually oak and elm as the climate warmed. Alder thrived in the wetter areas, while willow and poplar lined the riverbanks. This wasn't just generic forest. This was a specific ecological community with a traceable history, changing over time in response to climate and environmental shifts. The pollen also revealed something crucial about timing. By correlating their pollen sequences with samples from dated archaeological sites on land, Clark and the Godwins could establish when different layers had formed. The picture that emerged was remarkable. The forests beneath the North Sea had flourished during the Mesolithic period, roughly 8 to 10,000 years ago. This was the same era as the Kalinda harpoon, the same era as other artifacts that fishermen kept pulling from the deep. The pollen didn't just prove that dry land had existed, it proved that the land had been there at exactly the right time for humans to have lived on it. This was the breakthrough the scientific community had been waiting for. Pollen analysis provided something that Clement Reid's observations couldn't, a way to objectively test hypotheses about the past. You could argue about interpretations of tree stumps or artifacts, but you couldn't argue with pollen counts. The microscopic evidence was there for anyone to verify, layer by layer, grain by grain. The submerged forests weren't legend, they weren't speculation, and they definitely weren't Noah's flood. They were ecosystems that could be reconstructed with scientific precision. Clark would go on to become one of the most influential archaeologists of the 20th century, and his work on Mesolithic Britain fundamentally changed how we understand prehistoric hunter-gatherers. But his contribution to the North Sea story was establishing a methodology, a way of combining archaeological evidence with environmental reconstruction to build a complete picture of past landscapes. The pollen work proved that the techniques existed to study places that no longer existed, to map worlds that had vanished beneath the waves. The Godwins, meanwhile, continued their pollen research for decades, training a new generation of palynologists who would apply these methods across Europe and beyond. Harry Godwin became a towering figure in the field, and the couple's techniques became standard tools in any archaeologist's toolkit. Every time a researcher today analyses pollen from an ancient site, they're building on foundations that the Godwins laid in their Cambridge laboratory. What makes this chapter of the story so satisfying is the vindication it provided for Clement Reid's forgotten ideas. Everything he had proposed in 1913, the extensive dry land beneath the North Sea, the gradual flooding as sea levels rose, the implications for human prehistory, was confirmed by the pollen evidence. Reid had been right all along, working from limited data and pure logical deduction. The new generation of scientists had the tools to prove it, but the vision was his. Sometimes the best thing you can do for a dead visionary is prove that their vision was correct. The pollen analysis also raised tantalizing new questions. If the landscape beneath the North Sea had been so rich and diverse, how many people might have lived there? What kind of communities had they formed? How had they coped as their worlds slowly drowned around them? The microscopic grains could tell you what grew in a place, but they couldn't tell you about the human drama that had unfolded there. For that, scientists would need different tools, different approaches, and a new way of thinking about the relationship between geography and human history. The pollen had opened a door, but the real exploration of the lost world was only beginning. For decades, the drowned land beneath the North Sea had a problem that might seem trivial, but was actually enormous. It didn't have a name. Scientists referred to it with clunky phrases like the submerged North Sea plain, or the former land bridge between Britain and Europe, or, when they were feeling particularly uninspired, that area where all the artifacts keep coming from. Try getting the public excited about the submerged North Sea plain. Try writing a compelling grant application about that area where all the artifacts keep coming from. It's like trying to make people care about a character in a movie who's only ever called that guy. Names matter. Names transform abstract concepts into concrete places. Think about it. Pompeii instantly conjures images of frozen tragedy and volcanic destruction. Machu Picchu sounds exotic and mysterious, even if you know nothing about it. The Titanic carries emotional weight that ship that sank simply doesn't have. Without a proper name, the lost world beneath the North Sea remained a curiosity, a footnote, a problem for specialists to worry about while everyone else got on with their lives. Enter Brian E. Coles, a professor of archaeology at the University of Exeter, and the person who would finally give this ghost continent an identity. In the 1990s, Coles was working on wetland archaeology, the study of ancient sites preserved in bogs, marshes, and other waterlogged environments. This naturally led her to think about the biggest waterlogged environment of them all, the floor of the North Sea. She realised that what the field needed wasn't just more data or more sophisticated analysis techniques. What it needed was a way to make people actually care about this lost landscape. Her solution was brilliantly simple. She named it Doggerland after the Dogger Bank, that shallow sandbank in the middle of the North Sea where so many artefacts had been recovered over the years. The name itself had history, derived from medieval Dutch fishing vessels called doggers that had worked these waters for centuries. It was memorable, it was specific, and most importantly, it was a proper place name rather than a description. Suddenly, the submerged North Sea plain became Doggerland, a real location with boundaries you could draw on a map, a history you could investigate, and a story you could tell. The psychological impact of this naming cannot be overstated. Before Coles, talking about the underwater landscape felt like discussing a hypothesis. After Coles, it felt like discussing a country, one that happened to be underwater, sure, but a country nonetheless. Researchers could now say they were studying Doggerland rather than the area formerly above water in the North Sea basin. Journalists could write headlines about Doggerland, documentary makers could create programs about Doggerland. The name gave everyone a hook to hang their interest on. But Coles didn't stop at just providing a catchy label. She began the painstaking work of actually mapping this lost world, synthesizing decades of research to create the first comprehensive visualizations of what Doggerland might have looked like at different points in time. This was detective work of the highest order. She had to combine geological data about ancient coastlines, paleoclimatic data about temperature and sea levels, archaeological data about human settlement patterns, and ecological data about what plants and animals would have lived there. Each piece of evidence was fragmentary. Putting them together required imagination disciplined by scholarship. The maps Coles produced were revelations. They showed that Doggerland wasn't just some narrow land bridge connecting Britain to Europe. It was an enormous territory in its own right. At its maximum extent, around 12,000 years ago, it was larger than many modern European countries. We're talking about an area that could have swallowed the Netherlands, Belgium, and a good chunk of Denmark without even noticing. Rivers that now empty separately into the North Sea, the Thames, the Rhine, the Elbe, once flowed across this landscape, joining together in a vast drainage system before eventually reaching the Atlantic. Coles mapped how this world had changed over time as sea levels rose following the last ice age. Around 12,000 years ago, Doggerland was still largely intact, though the ice sheets that had once covered northern Britain were retreating rapidly. By 10,000 years ago, the North Sea had begun to form, but Doggerland remained substantial, still connected to both Britain and the continent, still providing hunting grounds and living space for Mesolithic populations. By 8,000 years ago, the flooding had accelerated dramatically, fragmenting Doggerland into a series of islands and peninsulas. And by 6,000 years ago, it was almost entirely gone, reduced to a few scattered shoals that would eventually become the Dogger Bank we know today. These maps did something remarkable. They made absence visible. By showing what had been there, Coles helped people understand what had been lost. Looking at her reconstructions, you could see the rivers where people had fished, the forests where they had hunted, the coastlines where they had gathered shellfish and watched the sunset over waters that no longer exist. The maps turned Doggerland from an academic curiosity into an imaginable world, a place you could mentally inhabit even though you could never physically visit. The naming also had practical effects on research funding and institutional support. We're studying Doggerland sounds like a defined project with clear objectives. We're investigating various submerged landscapes in the North Sea region. Sounds like you're not quite sure what you're doing. Universities could establish Doggerland research programs. Museums could create Doggerland exhibitions. The name gave the field a brand, and in academia as in business, branding matters more than anyone likes to admit. Coles continued to refine her maps throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s, incorporating new data as it became available. Each revision added detail, correcting earlier assumptions and filling in gaps. The project attracted collaborators from across Europe, turning what had been a scattered collection of individual researchers into a genuine scientific community focused on a common goal. Doggerland had gone from forgotten backwater to active research frontier, and much of that transformation came down to the simple power of having a name. The next breakthrough in understanding Doggerland came from the last place you'd expect, the petroleum industry. Oil companies aren't exactly known for their contributions to archaeological research. Their relationship with the past typically involves extracting dead organisms from the ground and turning them into greenhouse gases, not carefully reconstructing ancient landscapes. But in one of history's more ironic plot twists, the oil industry's relentless quest to find more stuff to burn ended up providing scientists with the most detailed picture of Doggerland ever created. Here's how it happened. Starting in the 1960s and accelerating through subsequent decades, oil companies poured billions of dollars into exploring the North Sea. This wasn't charity. There's an enormous amount of oil and natural gas beneath those cold grey waters, and extracting it required knowing exactly what the seafloor looked like. The tool of choice was seismic surveying, which works by sending sound waves down through the water and sediment, then recording the echoes that bounce back from different geological layers. It's essentially echolocation on an industrial scale, and it produces incredibly detailed three-dimensional images of everything beneath the surface. The oil companies were looking for rock formations that might contain petroleum deposits, anticlines, fault traps, stratigraphic traps, all the geological structures where oil tends to accumulate. They couldn't care less about archaeology. A prehistoric river channel was just noise in their data, something to filter out while searching for the really valuable stuff. But here's the thing about seismic data. It records everything, whether you're interested in it or not. All those ancient river systems, all those buried hills and valleys, all those features that had nothing to do with oil extraction. They showed up in the surveys anyway, captured in exquisite detail, and then filed away in corporate archives where nobody with archaeological interest could see them. For decades, this treasure trove of information remained locked behind corporate doors. Oil companies aren't in the habit of sharing proprietary data with academic researchers, especially when that data cost millions of dollars to collect. The information about Doggerland's topography existed, but it might as well have been on the moon for all the good it did archaeologists. This is one of the frustrating realities of modern science. Sometimes the data you need is sitting in someone's filing cabinet, but institutional barriers make it impossible to access. The breakthrough came when a team based at the University of Birmingham, led by Professor Vince Gaffney, managed to negotiate access to some of this seismic data. The arrangements were complicated. Oil companies are touchy about their surveys even when they've finished exploiting a particular area, but eventually enough data was released to allow genuine archaeological analysis. What the team found exceeded everyone's expectations. The seismic images revealed Doggerland not as a vague, featureless plain, but as a complex landscape with distinct geographical features. There were river valleys, actual valleys you could trace for miles across the seafloor, complete with tributaries and floodplains. There were hills and ridges that would have provided high ground for settlement. There were what appeared to be lake beds and marshy depressions. The level of detail was staggering. In some places you could practically see individual features that might have been significant to the people who lived there. A particularly prominent hillock, a confluence of streams, a sheltered inlet. The Birmingham team, later joined by collaborators at other institutions, began systematically mapping these features and correlating them with what was known from archaeology and environmental science. They identified what they believed were optimal locations for Mesolithic settlement, places with access to fresh water, good drainage, proximity to hunting and fishing grounds, and natural shelter from the elements. Some of these locations corresponded to areas where artifacts had been recovered by fishing trawlers, providing independent confirmation that the seismic interpretations were on the right track. One of the most striking discoveries was the sheer scale of the river systems that had once crossed Doggerland. The ancient Thames hadn't emptied into the sea where modern London stands. It had flowed east across a broad plain, eventually joining with the Rhine and other continental rivers in a massive combined waterway that the researchers nicknamed the Channel River. This mega river had drained much of northwestern Europe, carrying meltwater from retreating glaciers and providing a highway of sorts for both fish and the humans who depended on them. Imagining this landscape requires a complete mental reset. The geography we take for granted simply didn't exist. The seismic data also revealed features that hinted at catastrophic events. In some areas, there were what appeared to be debris flows and slump deposits, evidence of underwater landslides that had reshaped the seafloor. Other areas showed signs of rapid sedimentation, as if large amounts of material had been deposited in short periods of time. These features would later become crucial evidence for understanding how Doggerland met its end, but at this stage they were just intriguing anomalies that demanded explanation. What made the oil company data so valuable was its coverage. Individual archaeological excavations can tell you a lot about specific sites, but they're like looking at a landscape through a keyhole. The seismic surveys covered vast areas, thousands of square kilometres of seafloor, imaged in 3 dimensions at resolutions that allowed features just a few metres across to be identified. For the first time, researchers could see Doggerland as a whole, rather than as a collection of scattered data points. They could trace how rivers connected, how topography varied from region to region, how the landscape would have looked to someone actually standing on it thousands of years ago. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved. Oil extraction is one of the primary drivers of the climate change that threatens to submerge coastal regions around the world, the same process that drowned Doggerland thousands of years ago. The petroleum industry had inadvertently documented a prehistoric casualty of sea level rise, while actively contributing to conditions that might create new casualties in the future. It's the kind of cosmic joke that history seems to enjoy playing, connecting past and present in ways that nobody planned and few find comfortable to contemplate. The collaboration between archaeologists and the oil industry continued to develop through the 2000s and 2010s, with more data being released and more sophisticated analysis techniques being applied. New imaging technologies allowed even finer resolution, revealing features that earlier surveys had missed. Machine learning algorithms helped identify patterns in the vast datasets that human analysts might have overlooked. What had started as a happy accident, archaeologists gaining access to data collected for completely different purposes, evolved into a genuine research program with its own momentum and institutional support. Today, our maps of Doggerland are more detailed than our maps of some parts of the modern ocean floor. We know where the major rivers ran, where the hills rose, where the wetlands spread. We can make educated guesses about which areas would have supported forests and which would have been open grassland. We can identify spots that would have been attractive for human settlement, and model how populations might have moved across the landscape as conditions changed. All of this knowledge exists because oil companies wanted to find petroleum and accidentally photographed an entire lost world in the process. Sometimes science advances through careful planning and rigorous methodology, and sometimes it advances because someone was looking for one thing and found something completely different. So we've established that Doggerland existed, that it was enormous, and that we can now map it in remarkable detail thanks to pollen analysis and accidentally helpful oil companies. But maps and geological surveys only tell part of the story. The really interesting question, the one that keeps archaeologists awake at night and makes this whole subject actually matter, is about the people. Who were the inhabitants of this lost world? What were their lives like? And can we possibly know anything meaningful about individuals who lived 8,000 years ago and left behind nothing but scattered bones and stone tools? The short answer is yes, we can know quite a lot. The longer answer involves one of the most remarkable archaeological sites in Europe, some genuinely creepy ritual objects, and a dead guy from a cave in Somerset who completely upended our assumptions about what prehistoric Britons actually looked like. Buckle up, because we're about to meet the Doggerlanders. The problem with studying Mesolithic hunter-gatherers is that they didn't leave much behind. These weren't people who built pyramids or carved their names into temple walls. They moved with the seasons, following game animals and gathering wild plants, carrying their possessions on their backs and leaving only the faintest traces of their passing. Most of what they owned was made from organic materials: wood, leather, plant fibres, bone, stuff that rots away to nothing within a few generations unless conditions are absolutely perfect for preservation. Finding a Mesolithic site is hard enough. Finding one where anything useful has survived is like winning the archaeological lottery. Which brings us to Starcar, a waterlogged site in North Yorkshire that has been called the most important Mesolithic excavation in Europe. It's not much to look at today, just a patch of boggy ground near the village of Sema, about 5 miles south of Scarborough. But around 11,000 years ago, this area was the shore of a large lake, and the people who camped there left behind an astonishing collection of artifacts preserved by the waterlogged conditions. When archaeologists first excavated the site in the late 1940s and early 1950s, They could hardly believe what they were finding. The star attractions, pun absolutely intended, were the antler headdresses. 21 of them in total, made from the skulls of red deer with the antlers still attached. The skulls had been carefully modified, with holes cut through the bone to reduce weight and allow straps to be threaded through for wearing. These weren't hunting disguises or practical headgear. These were ritual objects, almost certainly used in ceremonies or spiritual practices that we can only guess at. Imagine encountering someone wearing one of these things in the flickering firelight, a figure with a human body and a stag's head, moving in ways that blurred the boundary between human and animal. It's the kind of image that sticks with you, and it tells us something profound about how these people understood their relationship with the natural world. The headdresses suggest a spiritual life far more complex than the primitive savage stereotype that Victorian-era scholars applied to prehistoric peoples. These weren't grunting cavemen bonking each other over the head with clubs. These were people with beliefs, rituals, and symbolic systems sophisticated enough to require specialized ceremonial equipment. We don't know exactly what the headdresses meant to them, whether they represented gods, ancestors, animal spirits, or something we can't even conceptualize, but we know they mattered enough to invest significant time and skill in creating them. Starkar also yielded evidence of sophisticated craftsmanship in more practical domains. The people who lived there made barbed points for hunting and fishing, similar to the Kalinda harpoon that started this whole story. They produced scrapers and blades from flint, brought from sources many miles away, suggesting extensive knowledge of the landscape and long-distance trade networks or travel routes. They worked antler and bone into a variety of tools, each designed for specific tasks. This wasn't random improvisation, it was skilled manufacturing based on accumulated knowledge passed down through generations. Perhaps most surprisingly, Starkar provided evidence that Mesolithic people built structures, not just temporary shelters, but actual buildings with prepared floors and possibly walls. One structure had a floor made of split timbers, carefully laid out and maintained over time. This challenges the assumption that hunter-gatherers were constantly on the move, never staying in one place long enough to invest in infrastructure. The Starkar inhabitants apparently returned to this lakeside location repeatedly, perhaps seasonally, and had made it comfortable enough to be worth the effort of construction. The site also revealed something about diet and daily life. Animal bones showed that the inhabitants hunted red deer, roe deer, wild boar, elk, and aurochs, the massive wild cattle that once roamed Europe before going extinct in the 17th century. They caught fish and collected waterfowl. They gathered hazelnuts and other plant foods. This was a diverse, protein-rich diet that would have supported active, healthy lifestyles. Not exactly the gourmet dining experience you'd get at a modern restaurant, but nutritionally speaking, these people probably ate better than many medieval peasants would thousands of years later. No processed foods, no refined sugars, just wild game and foraged plants prepared over open fires. Paleo diet enthusiasts would be impressed, though they might struggle with the lack of food delivery apps. But Starkar, remarkable as it is, sits on dry land in Yorkshire. How do we connect it to the lost world of Doggerland beneath the North Sea? The answer is that Starkar represents just one edge of a much larger world. 11,000 years ago, when people were camping by that Yorkshire lake, Doggerland still existed as a vast lowland plain to the east. The inhabitants of Starkar weren't isolated. They were part of a broader population that spread across what is now the North Sea basin. The rivers, forests and marshes of Doggerland would have supported similar communities, similar lifestyles, similar ritual practices. Starkar gives us a window into that world, a glimpse of what life was like for the thousands of people whose homeland now lies beneath 50 feet of seawater. The connection becomes even clearer when we consider the genetic evidence. In 1903, workers draining a cave in Cheddar Gorge, Somerset, discovered an almost complete human skeleton. This individual, eventually dubbed Cheddar Man, had died around 10,000 years ago, roughly contemporary with the Starkar occupation, and well within the period when Doggerland was inhabited. For over a century, Cheddar Man was displayed in museums and studied by scientists, but the really groundbreaking analysis didn't happen until 2018, when advances in ancient DNA technology allowed researchers to sequence his genome. The results were, to put it mildly, surprising. For generations, people had assumed that prehistoric Britons looked more or less like modern Britons, pale-skinned, probably with various hair and eye colours. Cheddar Man demolished that assumption completely. His DNA revealed that he almost certainly had dark brown to black skin, blue eyes, and dark curly hair. This wasn't some exotic immigrant. This was what native Mesolithic Britons actually looked like. The pale skin that most modern Europeans have is a relatively recent adaptation, probably linked to the spread of agriculture and changes in diet that reduced vitamin D intake. Hunter-gatherers like Cheddarman got plenty of vitamin D from fish and game, so they didn't need lighter skin to synthesize it from sunlight. The reconstruction of Cheddarman's face, based on his skull shape and genetic data, shows a man who would stand out on any modern British street, not because he was unusual for his time, but because our expectations are so thoroughly wrong. He had high cheekbones, a broad nose, and features that many people today would code as African or mixed race. This was the face of Mesolithic Britain, the face of the people who inhabited Doggerland during its final millennia. If you could travel back in time to walk the forests and marshes of the Lost World, these are the faces you would see. The Cheddarman findings triggered predictable controversy, mostly from people who had strong opinions about what prehistoric Britons should have looked like. Some accused the researchers of political correctness or pushing an agenda. But the science is solid. Multiple lines of genetic evidence from multiple Mesolithic individuals across Europe tell the same story. The hunter-gatherers of this period had dark skin and often light-coloured eyes, a combination that modern humans find striking because it's so rare today. The people of Doggerland weren't white Europeans in the modern sense. They were something different, something that no longer exists anywhere on Earth. Genetic studies have revealed other details about Mesolithic populations. They were adapted to their environment in ways that modern populations aren't, carrying genetic variants that help them process the high-protein, high-fat diet of hunter-gatherers. They had strong immune systems, honed by thousands of years of exposure to the diseases of their era. They were also surprisingly diverse. Different Mesolithic populations across Europe had distinct genetic signatures, suggesting limited interbreeding between groups and long periods of relative isolation. The people of Doggerland would have been genetically distinct from the people of southern France or Eastern Europe, their gene pools shaped by millennia of adaptation to the specific conditions of the North Sea lowlands. What were their lives actually like on a day-to-day basis? Based on Starkar and other Mesolithic sites, we can sketch an outline. They lived in small groups, probably extended families or bands of a few dozen individuals at most. They moved seasonally, following the migration patterns of game animals and the ripening of wild plants. Summer might be spent at coastal locations, fishing and gathering shellfish. Autumn could mean hunting deer in the forests as the animals fattened up for winter. Winter camps might be in sheltered valleys, conserving energy and living off stored foods. Spring would bring the return of migratory birds and the thawing of frozen waterways. Their technology was sophisticated within its limitations. They couldn't smelt metal or fire pottery. Those innovations lay thousands of years in the future. But they could work flint into razor-sharp blades, craft bows and arrows accurate enough to bring down deer at 50 paces, build boats capable of navigating rivers and coastal waters, and create clothing from animal hides that kept them warm through northern winters. They knew their environment intimately, understanding the habits of every animal species, the properties of every useful plant, the patterns of weather and seasons that governed survival. This wasn't primitive knowledge. It was expert knowledge, refined over hundreds of generations and passed down through oral traditions that we will never fully recover. They had art, or at least aesthetic sensibilities. Bone and antler objects from Mesolithic sites often show decorative marks, geometric patterns, incised lines, shapes that serve no practical purpose but clearly meant something to their creators. They had music. Bone flutes have been found at sites across Europe, simple instruments that could nevertheless produce melodies. They had stories, certainly, though we can only guess at their contents. The deerskull headdresses hint at rich mythological traditions involving human-animal transformation, spirit journeys, and relationships with the natural world that modern urban humans can barely imagine. And they had each other. Burial sites from the Mesolithic period show that people were laid to rest with care, sometimes accompanied by grave goods, sometimes in positions that suggest specific beliefs about death and the afterlife. These weren't bodies dumped unceremoniously. They were individuals mourned by communities, remembered by the people who survived them. A mother might have wept over a child taken by disease. A hunter might have been celebrated after his death for the skills that fed his family for decades. An elder might have been honoured for the knowledge she carried, the stories she told, the wisdom she passed to younger generations. The people of Doggerland were fully human in every sense that matters. They loved and grieved, told jokes and held grudges, worried about the future and remembered the past. They looked at the same stars we see and wondered about their place in the universe. They noticed that the sea was rising, that familiar coastlines were changing, that the world their grandparents knew was slowly disappearing. They couldn't have understood why this was happening. They had no concept of ice ages or global climate cycles. They just knew that the waters kept coming year after year, generation after generation, swallowing more and more of the land they called home. Understanding who these people were makes their fate all the more poignant. This wasn't an abstract catastrophe that happened to anonymous prehistoric populations. It happened to people like Cheddar Man, individuals with faces, families, hopes, and fears. It happened to communities that had lived in Doggerland for thousands of years, adapting to its environments and making it their own. When the waters finally claimed the last of their homeland, it wasn't just geography that was lost. It was a culture, a way of life, and countless individual stories that will never be told. Now that we know who lived in Doggerland, let's talk about why they lived there. Because here's the thing, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers weren't stupid. They didn't just wander around randomly hoping to bump into dinner. They went where the resources were, and Doggerland had resources in absolutely ridiculous abundance. We're talking about an ecosystem so productive, so overflowing with everything a human could possibly need, that it makes modern supermarkets look like sad little convenience stores with nothing but stale chips and warm soda. To understand why Doggerland was such prime real estate, you need to understand what happens when an ice age ends. For tens of thousands of years, northern Europe had been locked under massive glaciers, ice sheets miles thick covering everything from Scandinavia to northern Britain. Sea levels were dramatically lower because all that water was trapped in frozen form on land. The North Sea basin wasn't a sea at all. It was a vast lowland plain, cold and largely barren during the glacial maximum, scoured by winds blowing off the ice sheets to the north. Then, starting around 20,000 years ago, the climate began to warm. The glaciers started melting, retreating northward century by century, and as they retreated, life followed. First came the pioneer species, cold-tolerant grasses and shrubs, lichens and mosses, the hardy plants that could colonize bare ground left behind by retreating ice. Then came the trees, birch and pine at first, later hazel, oak, elm and lime as conditions continued warming. Animals followed the vegetation, reindeer and elk initially, then red deer, roe deer, wild boar, and the massive aurochs. By around 10,000 years ago, Doggerland had transformed from frozen wasteland to temperate paradise. The geography of this paradise was uniquely favourable. Doggerland sat in what we might call the sweet spot of post-glacial Europe, far enough south to escape the worst cold, but positioned to benefit from the rich ecosystems developing as ice retreated. The land itself was mostly low-lying, gently rolling terrain crossed by numerous rivers and dotted with lakes, marshes and wetlands. These weren't obstacles to human settlement. They were features that made the landscape incredibly productive for hunter-gatherers. Let's break down exactly what made Doggerland such a buffet of natural resources, because the variety is honestly impressive. First, the forests. As the climate warmed, Doggerland developed extensive woodlands dominated by oak, hazel, elm and lime, with alder in wetter areas and pine on sandier soils. These weren't the dark, impenetrable forests of fairy tales. They were relatively open woodlands with clearings, glades and forest edges, where sunlight reached the ground and diverse plant communities flourished. For hunter-gatherers, this was perfect. Forest edges are among the most productive environments on Earth, combining the resources of both woodland and open habitats. You could hunt deer moving between forest and clearing, gather nuts from the hazel groves, and find medicinal plants in the sun-dappled understory. The hazelnut harvest alone would have been a major annual event. Hazelnuts are calorie-dense, easy to store, and absolutely delicious when roasted over a fire. Basically the prehistoric equivalent of trail mix, except you had to crack each one yourself because Costco wouldn't exist for another 9,000 years. Archaeological sites from this period are often littered with hazelnut shells, suggesting that these nuts formed a significant portion of the diet during autumn and winter months. Then there were the animals, and we're not talking about the sad, depleted wildlife populations of modern Europe. Doggerland hosted megafauna that would make any modern hunter weep with envy. Red deer roamed in vast herds, providing meat, hides, antlers, and bone for tools. Roe deer offered smaller but still substantial game. Wild boar crashed through the undergrowth, dangerous but delicious. Elk, the giant deer that Americans confusingly call moose, stood taller than a man at the shoulder and provided enough meat from a single kill to feed a family for weeks. And then there were the aurochs. If you've never heard of aurochs, imagine a cow, but terrifying. These were the wild ancestors of domestic cattle, and they were absolutely massive. Bulls could weigh over a ton, with horns spanning more than 2 feet. Hunting an aurochs was not for the faint of heart. These animals could and did kill people who approached them carelessly, but successfully bringing one down meant an enormous payoff in meat, fat, and hide. Cave paintings across Europe show aurochs as objects of fascination and perhaps worship, and it's easy to see why. They were simultaneously the most dangerous and most rewarding game animal on the continent. Horses also roamed Doggerland, though these weren't the domesticated animals we know today. Wild horses of the Mesolithic were smaller, stockier, and considerably less interested in being ridden. They were prey, not partners, another source of meat and hides for communities that knew how to hunt them. The same was true of bison, which still survived in parts of Europe during this period, though their numbers were declining from Ice Age peaks. But Doggerland's abundance wasn't limited to large mammals. The rivers and lakes teemed with fish: pike, perch, bream, trout, and salmon during spawning runs that must have been spectacular to witness. Fishing technology had advanced considerably by the Mesolithic, with nets, traps, hooks, and spears all in use. A productive fishing spot could provide reliable protein year-round, supplementing the more variable returns from hunting. The wetlands added another dimension to this cornucopia. Marshes and bogs might seem like obstacles to modern eyes, but to Mesolithic hunter-gatherers they were grocery stores. Waterfowl nested in reeds and rushes, ducks, geese, swans, herons, and dozens of other species that could be hunted or trapped. Their eggs provided seasonal bonuses of high-quality protein. Edible plants grew in profusion along wetland margins: water lilies with their starchy rhizomes, bulrushes, various sedges and reeds. Shellfish accumulated in estuaries where rivers met the sea. The coastline itself, and Doggerland had an extensive coastline before the flooding accelerated, offered yet more resources. Seals hauled out on beaches and sandbars, providing meat, blubber, and waterproof hides. Seabirds nested in colonies that must have numbered in the millions. Stranded whales and dolphins, though rare, would have provided occasional windfalls of food and raw materials. The intertidal zone offered shellfish, crabs, seaweed, and other marine resources that could be gathered with minimal risk or effort. The climate of Doggerland during its heyday was genuinely pleasant by the standards of northwestern Europe. We're talking about temperatures comparable to or slightly warmer than modern Britain, with mild winters and warm summers. This wasn't the Mediterranean, but it wasn't the frozen north either. People could live comfortably in hide tents or simple wooden structures without the constant threat of freezing to death. Winters required planning and preparation, but they weren't the survival ordeals faced by communities living closer to the remaining ice sheets. All of this abundance had an important consequence. Doggerland could support a relatively dense human population by hunter-gatherer standards. We're not talking about cities or even villages in the agricultural sense. But communities could be larger, could stay in one place longer, and could enjoy a higher standard of living than hunter-gatherers in less productive environments. The archaeological evidence from sites like Starkar suggests semi-permanent settlements, repeated returns to favoured locations, and the kind of investment in infrastructure that only makes sense when you know you'll be back. Population estimates for Mesolithic Doggerland are necessarily speculative, but researchers have suggested that the entire region might have supported tens of thousands of people, perhaps comparable to the population of a small modern city, spread across an area the size of a European country. These weren't isolated bands struggling to survive in a hostile environment. They were thriving communities embedded in a landscape that provided for their every need. This abundance also meant that Doggerland was probably the population centre of Mesolithic Europe, or at least one of the major ones. When you have an environment this productive, people accumulate. Families grow larger because children are more likely to survive. Groups split and form new communities rather than dying out. Over generations, the population increases until it reaches the carrying capacity of the environment. Doggerland's carrying capacity was high, which means its population would have been correspondingly substantial. But here's the cruel irony that gives this story its tragic edge. The same features that made Doggerland so productive also made it incredibly vulnerable. The low-lying terrain that created all those wonderful wetlands was, by definition, barely above sea level. The rivers and lakes that provided fish and waterfowl were connected to an ocean that was slowly, inexorably rising. The abundant forests grew on land that would eventually be seafloor. Everything that made Doggerland paradise was also what made it doomed. The people living there couldn't have known this, of course. They saw an environment that had supported their ancestors for generations and assumed it would continue forever. The changes happening around them were slow enough to be nearly invisible within a single lifetime. A few inches of sea level rise here, a familiar beach becoming a little narrower there. By the time anyone might have recognized the pattern, by the time the elders started telling stories about lands their grandparents had known that were now underwater, it was already far too late to do anything about it. And this is what makes Doggerland's story so haunting. It wasn't a sudden catastrophe that wiped out an unprepared population. It was a slow-motion disaster that unfolded over millennia, with generation after generation adapting to gradually worsening conditions until there was simply nowhere left to adapt to. The paradise slowly drowned, and its inhabitants could do nothing but watch and eventually retreat to higher ground, to Britain, to the continent, to places that still exist on modern maps. The ecology of abundance became the ecology of loss. The forests that provided hazelnuts and deer became submerged stumps on the seafloor. The rivers that teemed with fish became submarine channels visible only in seismic surveys. The wetlands that fed millions of birds became empty expanses of salt water. Doggerland's very productivity might have made the loss more devastating, more people affected, more communities disrupted, more of human history erased as the waters rose. When we talk about Doggerland's ecology, we're not just describing an ancient environment. We're describing a home, a place where real people built real lives, generation after generation, taking for granted the abundance that surrounded them. They couldn't have imagined a world where all of this would be gone, reduced to myths and archaeological fragments and occasional artifacts pulled up by bewildered fishermen. But that's exactly what happened. The paradise they knew became the sea we sail on, and only now are we beginning to understand what was lost. While scientists analyze seismic data and debate academic theories, some of the most exciting discoveries about Doggerland are being made by ordinary people with no formal training whatsoever. Welcome to the democratization of archaeology, where your weekend hobby might just rewrite prehistory, and where the line between professional researcher and enthusiastic amateur has become wonderfully blurred. The unlikely epicenter of this citizen science revolution is a place called the Zandmotor, which translates from Dutch as sand engine, and yes, that's exactly as weird as it sounds. Located on the coast of the Netherlands near The Hague, the Zandmotor is a massive artificial peninsula created in 2011 as an experiment in coastal engineering. The Dutch, being the Dutch, decided that instead of constantly fighting the sea with traditional barriers, they would try a different approach, dump 21 million cubic meters of sand in one spot, and let natural currents gradually distribute it. Along the coastline, it's basically using the ocean as a free sand delivery service, which is either brilliant or completely insane depending on your perspective. But here's where it gets interesting for our story. That sand had to come from somewhere, and that somewhere was the bottom of the North Sea, the very sea floor that was once the surface of Doggerland. When the dredging ships sucked up millions of tons of sediment and deposited it on the Dutch coast, they inadvertently created the world's largest archaeological time capsule. Mixed in with all that sand were artifacts and remains that had been sitting on the seabed for thousands of years, suddenly transported to a beach where anyone with sharp eyes and a bit of patience could find them. The discoveries started almost immediately after the Zandmotor was completed. Beachcombers noticed bones sticking out of the sand, not modern bones, but clearly ancient ones, mineralized and discolored by millennia underwater. Stone tools appeared, washed clean by the waves and lying on the beach like forgotten souvenirs from prehistory. Teeth from animals that hadn't walked the earth in tens of thousands of years showed up with surprising regularity. The Zandmotor had accidentally become an open-air museum where the exhibits kept emerging from the sand with every tide. Word spread quickly through the Netherlands community of amateur fossil hunters and archaeology enthusiasts. These weren't professional scientists with university positions and research grants. They were teachers, office workers, retirees, and students who spent their weekends walking the beach with their eyes fixed on the ground. They formed informal networks, sharing finds and pooling knowledge. They learned to recognize the difference between a random rock and a worked flint tool, between a modern animal bone and a Pleistocene mammoth molar. Some became genuinely expert, their pattern recognition skills honed by thousands of hours of practice. The finds from the Zanmotor span an almost incomprehensible range of time. Some artifacts date to the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age, when Neanderthals roamed the landscape that would eventually become Doggerland. Hand axes and scrapers made by our evolutionary cousins have been recovered from the beach, tools created by minds that were human but not quite like ours. These objects are typically over 40,000 years old, dating from periods when sea levels were even lower than during the Mesolithic, and when the North Sea basin was prime hunting territory for Neanderthal populations. Other finds date from the Mesolithic period we've been discussing, the era of Doggerland's human inhabitants, the dark-skinned, blue-eyed hunter-gatherers who built communities across the now-submerged landscape. Bone tools, worked antler and distinctive microliths, tiny stone blades that were hafted into wooden handles to create composite tools, all turn up on the Zanmotor's shores. Each piece is a direct connection to the people who made and used it, a tangible link to lives lived 8,000 or 10,000 years ago. The animal remains are equally spectacular. Mammoth bones and teeth are surprisingly common finds, remnants of the great herds that once grazed across the Doggerland steppe during colder periods. Woolly rhinoceros remains have appeared, another Ice Age giant that most people only know from museum displays. Bones from giant deer, cave lions, and hyenas emerge from the sand, a bestiary of extinct megafauna that reads like a fantasy novel, but was once everyday reality. Finding a mammoth tooth on your Sunday beach walk is the kind of experience that recalibrates your sense of time and scale. But perhaps the most poignant discoveries are the human remains. Bones from the people who actually lived in Doggerland occasionally wash up on the Zanmotor, fragments of individuals whose entire world now lies beneath the waves. These finds are treated with appropriate gravity. Human remains are reported to authorities and typically end up in museum collections, where they can be properly studied and respectfully preserved. But before they reach the scientists, there's often a moment when an amateur fossil hunter holds in their hands the physical remains of someone who lived thousands of years ago, and that moment is genuinely profound. One particularly striking find was a human mandible, a lower jawbone, identified as belonging to a male individual who was probably around 40 years old when he died. Analysis of the bone provided details about his life, his diet, his health, the wear patterns on his teeth that suggested how he used them as tools as well as for eating. This wasn't an abstract statistic or a theoretical population model. This was a specific person, someone who had a name and a family and a place in his community. He probably told jokes that made his friends laugh. He probably had opinions about the weather and preferences about food and memories of people he'd loved and lost. We'll never know any of these details, but the jawbone reminds us that they existed, that behind every artifact and data point were real human lives as complex and meaningful as our own. The Zanmotor has become something of a pilgrimage site for people interested in Doggerland. Visitors come from across Europe to walk its beaches, hoping to find their own connection to the lost world. Most go home empty-handed. Finding artifacts requires patience, luck, and trained eyes. But even the unsuccessful visits serve a purpose. They make people aware of Doggerland in a visceral, physical way that reading about it never could. Standing on sand dredged from the seabed, knowing that mammoth bones and Stone Age tools and human remains are mixed in somewhere beneath your feet, changes how you think about the landscape and its history. The Dutch model has inspired similar initiatives elsewhere. Artificial beach nourishment projects, where sand is pumped onto eroding coastlines to protect them, happen all over the world. In theory, any of these projects using North Sea sediment could be yielding similar archaeological treasures. The challenge is having people on the ground who know what to look for and understand the significance of what they find. The Zanmotor succeeded partly because the Netherlands already had a strong culture of amateur paleontology and fossil collecting. That community was ready to engage with the opportunity when it appeared. Professional archaeologists have had mixed reactions to this citizen science phenomenon. Some worry about untrained collectors disturbing contexts and losing valuable information about where exactly artifacts were found. Others celebrate the engagement and point out that without amateur involvement, most of these finds would simply wash away unnoticed. The compromise position, which seems to be winning out, is to encourage collection while promoting education about proper documentation and reporting. A found artifact that's photographed, GPS tagged and reported to researchers is infinitely more valuable than one that sits unnoticed in someone's drawer. The Zanmotor discoveries also raise uncomfortable questions about what else might be hidden beneath the North Sea. The sand that created this artificial beach came from a relatively small area of the seabed. If that limited sample yielded hundreds of significant finds, what treasures might lie in the vast unexplored regions of the former Doggerland? There could be intact settlement sites buried under sediment, preserved by the same waterlogged conditions that protected Starkar for 11,000 years. There could be boats, structures, even human remains still in their original burial positions. The logistics of underwater archaeology make systematic exploration prohibitively expensive, but the potential is tantalizing. For now, the amateur hunters continue their work, walking the beaches after every storm in hopes that the waves have exposed something new. They've formed communities, both online and in person, where finds are shared, expertise is exchanged, and the collective knowledge of Doggerland's material culture steadily grows. In a world where science often feels distant and inaccessible, the Zanmotor offers something remarkable: the chance for ordinary people to hold history in their hands and contribute meaningfully to our understanding of the past. Not bad for a pile of dredged sand. We've painted a picture of Doggerland as a paradise: abundant wildlife, productive ecosystems, thriving human communities. But this paradise had an expiration date, and the countdown had already started long before the first human set foot on its shores. The story of Doggerland's destruction is ultimately a story about water: where it was, where it went, and what happened when it came back. To understand the drowning of Doggerland, we need to think about ice. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 26,000 years ago, enormous ice sheets covered much of the northern hemisphere. We're talking about glaciers miles thick, containing so much frozen water that global sea levels were about 120 metres lower than they are today. That's nearly 400 feet, enough to expose vast continental shelves that are now underwater, including the entire North Sea basin. Britain wasn't an island. It was the northwestern peninsula of mainland Europe, connected by a broad land bridge that stretched from what is now France to what is now Denmark. Then the climate began to warm, and the ice began to melt. This wasn't a sudden catastrophe. It was a process that unfolded over thousands of years, with fits and starts, advances and retreats. But the overall trend was unmistakable. The glaciers shrank, the meltwater flowed into the oceans, and sea levels rose. By 12,000 years ago, the process was well underway. By 10,000 years ago, it had transformed the geography of Europe. And by 8,000 years ago, it had nearly finished off Doggerland entirely. The rate of sea level rise during this period was dramatic by geological standards, around 1 to 2 metres per century during the fastest phases. That might not sound like much, but remember that Doggerland was mostly low-lying terrain. A metre of sea level rise didn't just nibble at the coastline, it could advance the waterline by kilometres across flat, gently sloping land. And this wasn't a one-time event. It happened century after century, generation after generation, with each cohort of humans watching their world shrink a little more than their parents had known. Try to imagine what this looked like from the ground level. You grow up in a community near the coast, learning to fish in waters your grandfather taught you to navigate. The beach where you played as a child is underwater now, not dramatically, just gradually submerged as each spring tide reaches a little higher. The marshy areas where your family gathered waterfowl eggs have become permanently flooded, useless for anything but fishing. Old campsites that your grandmother talked about, places where the tribe used to gather for seasonal hunts, are now islands accessible only by boat, and some have disappeared entirely. The world is literally shrinking around you, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. The psychological impact of this slow-motion catastrophe must have been profound. These weren't people who understood ice ages or global climate patterns. They had no framework for comprehending why the sea kept taking more land, year after year, decade after decade. Some probably attributed it to angry gods or cosmic punishment. Others might have simply accepted it as the way things were, adapting their lives to an ever-changing coastline without trying to explain it. Either way, they were living through one of the great environmental transformations in human history, and they had no idea what was causing it or when, if ever, it would stop. The flooding wasn't perfectly steady. Climate during this period was remarkably unstable, with sudden shifts that could change conditions dramatically within decades or even years. One of the most significant of these events occurred around 8,200 years ago, and it accelerated Doggerland's demise catastrophically. In North America, the retreating Laurentide ice sheet had created enormous glacial lakes, bodies of meltwater trapped behind ice dams, some of them larger than all the modern Great Lakes combined. Around 8,200 years ago, one of these ice dams failed catastrophically, releasing an almost unimaginable flood of fresh water into the North Atlantic. The volume involved was staggering, enough water to raise global sea levels by perhaps half a metre in a geological instant. But the immediate sea level rise was only part of the problem. The massive influx of cold fresh water disrupted the Atlantic circulation patterns that keep northwestern Europe relatively warm. Temperatures across the region plummeted, possibly by several degrees Celsius, initiating a cold snap that lasted for several centuries. This 8.2 kiloyear event, as climate scientists call it, was the most severe rapid climate change event of the entire Holocene epoch, the period from the end of the last ice age to the present. For the already struggling inhabitants of Doggerland, this was devastating. The land they lived on was being swallowed by rising seas, even as the climate turned suddenly colder and more hostile. Their food sources were disrupted, animal migration patterns changed, plant communities shifted, the carefully accumulated knowledge of generations became suddenly less reliable. The population that Doggerland could support dropped sharply just as the habitable area was shrinking most rapidly. It was a perfect storm of environmental catastrophe, and the people caught in it had no way to escape except by abandoning their homeland entirely. By around 8,000 years ago, Doggerland had been reduced from a vast continental plain to a scattered archipelago of low-lying islands. The great rivers that had once crossed the landscape now emptied directly into the sea, their lower reaches submerged. The forests had retreated to higher ground, some of which was now in Britain, some in continental Europe, but none of which was in the drowning lowlands between. The human population had either fled or perished, their abandoned campsites and hunting grounds slowly vanishing beneath the encroaching waters. The islands that remained were marginal environments at best, small, exposed, lacking the diverse resources that had made Doggerland so productive. Some may have supported seasonal visitors, fishermen exploiting the rich waters or hunters pursuing seals and seabirds, but permanent settlement was no longer viable. The ecosystem that had sustained human communities for millennia was gone, replaced by open water that only deepened with each passing century. For the refugees who had fled to Britain and the continent, the loss of Doggerland meant more than just losing territory. It meant losing connections, trade routes, kinship networks, shared traditions and sacred sites that had bound communities together across the landscape. Britain, which had been a peninsula, became an island. Populations that had moved freely between what are now separate countries found themselves permanently divided by waters too deep and dangerous to cross casually. The cultural unity of the Mesolithic North Sea world fractured into isolated regional groups that would develop independently from this point forward. This is one of the underappreciated consequences of Doggerland's drowning. We tend to think of Britain as having always been an island, geographically and culturally distinct from the European mainland. But that isolation was created, not given, produced by rising seas that severed ancient connections and forced populations to develop in separation. The English Channel, which today separates Britain from France by just 20 miles at its narrowest point, was once a river valley that you could walk across without getting your feet wet. The insularity that would later shape British history and identity was a consequence of climate change operating on geological timescales, creating geography that felt permanent but was actually quite recent. The people who experienced the final stages of Doggerland's destruction must have felt like they were living through the end of the world. In a sense, they were. Their world, anyway. The landscape their ancestors had inhabited for hundreds of generations was disappearing forever, taking with it everything that made it home. They couldn't know that their descendants would spread across Britain and Europe, founding cultures and civilizations that would eventually send spacecraft to the moon and debate climate policy in Parliament. They only knew that the waters kept rising, the land kept shrinking, and the life they'd known was vanishing beneath the waves. The final islands of Doggerland probably lingered for a few more centuries after the 8.2 kiloyear event, slowly eroding and flooding until nothing remained above the surface. The Dogger Bank, that shallow area where fishermen would later haul up so many artifacts, marks the last high ground, the final refuge that eventually became nothing more than a navigational hazard for medieval shipping. The people were long gone by then, their descendants scattered across a Europe that was still adapting to post-glacial conditions, still figuring out new ways to live in a transformed world. But the story wasn't quite over. Doggerland had one more catastrophe in store, a final dramatic ending that would transform it from a gradually drowning landscape to a definitively vanished one. The slow drowning had taken millennia. What came next took only hours. The slow drowning of Doggerland was tragedy enough. Millennia of gradual loss, generation after generation watching their world shrink beneath rising waters. But nature, apparently unsatisfied with this prolonged agony, had one final catastrophe in store. What the centuries of sea level rise had failed to completely accomplish, a single autumn day would finish. And the instrument of this apocalypse was waiting on the seafloor off the coast of Norway, building pressure for thousands of years like the world's most patient ticking time bomb, the Storegga Slide. Even the name sounds ominous. Storegga means great edge in Norwegian, referring to the underwater cliff where this event originated. Around 6100 BCE, give or take a few decades, this great edge collapsed in one of the largest submarine landslides in Earth's recorded geological history. To call it a landslide doesn't really do it justice. We're talking about 3,000 cubic kilometers of rock and sediment, enough material to bury all of Manhattan under a layer roughly 30 miles deep, suddenly breaking loose and cascading down the continental slope into the abyssal depths of the Norwegian Sea. Let's pause to appreciate the sheer scale of this event, because human brains aren't really equipped to comprehend numbers this large. 3,000 cubic kilometers. If you tried to move that much material using dump trucks, working 24 hours a day with one truck arriving every minute, it would take approximately 57 million years. The Storegga Slide accomplished this in a matter of hours. This wasn't a disaster on a human scale. It was a disaster on a planetary scale, the kind of event that leaves scars visible from space and shows up in geological records across half a continent. The cause of the collapse was probably a combination of factors that had been building since the last ice age. The continental slope off Norway is steep, and it had accumulated enormous amounts of sediment over the millennia, material carried by glacial rivers, deposited by ocean currents, piled layer upon layer in an increasingly unstable mass. The retreating glaciers had also released pressure on the bedrock beneath, allowing it to slowly rebound upward in a process called isostatic adjustment. This gradual rising may have destabilized the sediment pile. Then there were methane hydrates, frozen methane trapped in the seafloor sediments, which can suddenly release when conditions change, effectively turning solid ground into a slippery mess. Add an earthquake to this volatile mix, and there's evidence suggesting seismic activity may have triggered the slide, and you have a recipe for catastrophe. When the slope finally gave way, the results were almost instantaneous on geological timescales. 3,000 cubic kilometers of material began moving, accelerating as it went, generating enough energy to register on seismographs that wouldn't be invented for another 8,000 years. The slide travelled down the continental slope at speeds estimated at over 100 kilometers per hour. Highway speeds, except instead of a car you have a mountain range's worth of debris hurtling toward the abyss. But the real horror wasn't the landslide itself, it was what the landslide created. When that much material suddenly displaces that much water, the result is a tsunami. Not the kind of tsunami you see in disaster movies, where a picturesque wave rolls toward a screaming crowd on a beach. This was something far more terrifying, a massive displacement of the entire water column, radiating outward from the slide zone at hundreds of kilometers per hour. By the time it reached the coastlines of the North Sea, the wave would have been between 5 and 10 meters high. Some estimates suggest it may have reached 20 meters in certain locations, where the seafloor topography focused the wave energy. Computer simulations of the Storegga tsunami paint a terrifying picture. The wave would have propagated outward from the Norwegian coast, crossing the North Sea in a matter of hours. It would have struck the Scottish coast first, sweeping inland for miles along low-lying areas. Then it would have continued south and west, hitting the remaining islands of Doggerland. those final refuges that had somehow survived the millennia of rising seas. And unlike the gradual flooding that had characterized Doggerland's slow death, this wave gave no warning and allowed no escape. For anyone living on those last Doggerland islands, the tsunami would have been the end of everything. Imagine the scene. It's autumn. We know this with surprising precision because of what scientists found in the geological record, but we'll get to that in a moment. The summer hunting season is over, and the scattered communities that still use the islands for seasonal activities are returning to the coast. They're setting up camps, preparing for the autumn seal hunt or the annual shellfish gathering, going about the routines their ancestors had followed for generations. The weather is cool but not yet cold, the days are getting shorter, and the familiar rhythms of life are playing out as they have for as long as anyone can remember. Then, the sea withdraws. This is one of the most recognizable warning signs of an approaching tsunami. The water pulls back dramatically, exposing seafloor that's normally underwater. To someone who had never experienced or heard of a tsunami, this might have seemed miraculous or terrifying or both. Fish flopping on exposed sand, rocks and shells visible that had always been submerged. Perhaps some people ran toward the retreating water, curious about this strange phenomenon. Perhaps others felt the instinctive dread that precedes catastrophe and ran the other way. Either way, they had only minutes. When the wave arrived, it would have been almost impossible to outrun on low-lying islands with nowhere to climb. A wall of water 5 to 10 meters high, moving at the speed of a jet aircraft, carrying debris and sediment in unstoppable force. Everything in its path would have been swept away. Camps, boats, tools, animals, and people. The survivors, if there were any, would have found themselves in open water miles from any remaining land, with everything they owned destroyed and everyone they knew probably dead. Now, about those cherry pits. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Strega tsunami research is how scientists have managed to pinpoint not just the year, but the season when the disaster occurred. The evidence comes from sediment cores taken from sites around the North Sea coast, layers of disturbed material left behind by the tsunami's passage. Within these tsunami deposits, researchers found botanical remains, including the pits of wild cherries. Cherry trees in northern Europe fruit in late summer and early autumn. The presence of cherry pits in the tsunami sediment strongly suggests that the wave struck during this season, when cherries would have been recently harvested and present at human habitation sites. There's something almost unbearably poignant about this detail. We can imagine a Mesolithic woman gathering wild cherries a few days before the disaster, carefully collecting fruit to dry for the coming winter. We can imagine children eating cherries and spitting out the pits around the campfire, the way children have done for thousands of years. Those discarded pits, that evidence of ordinary life, became markers of catastrophe when the wave came and buried everything under layers of transported sediment. 8,000 years later, scientists would find those pits and use them to reconstruct the timing of an apocalypse. The domestic became the forensic, and the mundane became the tragic. The Strega tsunami wasn't the first or last to strike the region. Geological evidence shows that similar landslides have occurred multiple times over the past million years, generating comparable waves. But the Strega event holds a unique place in history because of its timing. It struck at exactly the moment when Doggerland was most vulnerable, reduced to scattered islands that could offer no protection against flooding of this magnitude. The slow drowning had left only remnants. The tsunami swept those remnants away. Archaeological evidence from the post-tsunami period is stark in its absence. Before Strega, artifacts and human remains continue to appear in North Sea contexts, testaments to ongoing human activity on the remaining islands. After Strega, there's nothing. The archaeological record goes silent. Whatever communities had persisted on those final scraps of land, seasonal visitors, permanent holdouts, whoever they were, they either died in the wave or fled and never returned. Doggerland, which had been dying for millennia, was finally dead. The impact of the Strega tsunami extended far beyond Doggerland's last islands. Coastal communities around the entire North Sea rim would have been devastated. In Scotland, tsunami deposits have been found up to 80 kilometres inland in some locations, suggesting that the wave penetrated deep into river valleys and low-lying coastal areas. Shetland, Orkney, and the northeastern Scottish coast all show evidence of the tsunami's passage. Sites that had been occupied for generations were abandoned in its aftermath, their inhabitants either killed or displaced. For the broader Mesolithic population of northwestern Europe, the Strega tsunami may have been a defining catastrophe, a collective trauma that shaped cultural memory for generations. We have no written records from this period, of course, no contemporary accounts of the disaster, but we have something that might be even more significant: the stories that survived. Flood myths are found in cultures around the world, and many scholars have suggested that at least some of these stories may preserve genuine memories of ancient catastrophes. The biblical story of Noah, the Greek myth of Deucalion, the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, all feature great floods that destroy the old world and force humanity to start over. Could the Strega tsunami be one of the sources for these stories? It's impossible to prove, but it's also hard to dismiss. A disaster of this magnitude would have been seared into the collective memory of surviving populations. Parents would have told children, who would have told their children, who would have told their children. Over millennia, the specific details would have been lost, transformed, mythologized, but the core narrative of a great wave that swept away the old world might have persisted. When later cultures eventually developed writing, they may have recorded stories whose origins stretched back 8,000 years to a real event that really happened. This is speculative, of course. We'll probably never know for certain whether any specific flood myth derives from Strega or from the broader pattern of sea level rise that drowned Doggerland. But the connection is suggestive, and it reminds us that mythology often contains more truth than we realize. The stories we tell about the past shape how we understand the present, and sometimes those stories are trying to tell us something important. After the Strega wave receded, Doggerland entered a new phase of its existence, not as a land, not even as a memory for living humans, but as a ghost. The physical territory was gone, submerged beneath waters that would continue deepening for centuries to come. The people who had lived there were dead or dispersed, their descendants scattered across Britain and continental Europe with no way to return to a homeland that no longer existed. The artifacts and structures they had left behind were buried under layers of marine sediment, invisible and inaccessible. For all practical purposes, Doggerland had ceased to exist, and yet it persisted. Not in physical form, but in echoes, in the bones and tools that fishermen would eventually drag up in their nets, in the tree stumps that emerged at low tide on the Norfolk coast, in the oral traditions and myths that passed down through generations, long after anyone remembered what they originally referred to. Doggerland became a puzzle, a mystery, a lost world waiting to be rediscovered by people who had forgotten it was ever there. The rediscovery we've traced in this video, from Captain Lockwood's harpoon to Clement Reid's prophetic book, to the pollen analysis and seismic surveys and genetic revelations, has returned Doggerland to human consciousness. We now know more about this drowned landscape than Clement Reid could have dreamed possible when he walked the beaches of Norfolk over a century ago. We can map its rivers, identify its forests, describe its wildlife, and even reconstruct the faces of its inhabitants. The ghost has been given form, the mystery has been largely solved, and the lost world is lost no longer, at least not to human knowledge. But the story of Doggerland isn't just a fascinating piece of deep history. It's also a warning, and that warning has never been more relevant than it is today. We live in an era of accelerating climate change, driven not by natural cycles but by human activity. The carbon dioxide we've pumped into the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels is trapping heat, warming the planet and melting the ice sheets that still exist at the poles. Sea levels are rising again, not as fast as during the post-glacial flooding, but fast enough to threaten coastal communities around the world. The projections vary depending on how much more carbon we emit, but even conservative estimates suggest significant sea level rise over the coming century. More pessimistic scenarios paint pictures of a transformed world where many of today's coastal cities are partially or completely underwater. The parallels to Doggerland are uncomfortable because they're so direct. The people who lived in Doggerland watched their world shrink for generations, adapting as best they could to changing conditions until there was simply nowhere left to adapt to. They didn't understand why the seas were rising. They had no concept of ice ages or global climate systems. They just knew that the waters kept coming year after year, decade after decade, and that the land their ancestors had known was disappearing forever. We understand the mechanisms perfectly well. We have climate models and satellite measurements and ice core data and every scientific tool imaginable to document exactly what's happening and why. We know that burning fossil fuels releases carbon dioxide, that carbon dioxide traps heat, that heat melts ice, and that melted ice raises sea levels. The chain of causation is clear, documented, and essentially uncontested by the scientific community. And yet we continue pumping carbon into the atmosphere because changing our behaviour would be inconvenient and expensive and would require admitting that we've been doing something wrong for generations. The inhabitants of Doggerland had no choice. The climate changed around them for reasons completely beyond their control or understanding, and they dealt with the consequences as best they could. We have a choice. We understand what's happening, we know what's causing it, and we have the technology to change course. Whether we make that choice, whether we have the collective wisdom and political will to prevent the next Doggerland-scale catastrophe, remains to be seen. But there's another lesson in the Doggerland story, and it's not entirely pessimistic. The people who fled the drowning lowlands didn't vanish from history. They survived, adapted, and eventually thrived in new environments. Their descendants populated Britain and contributed to the genetic makeup of modern Europeans. The communities they built evolved into the complex societies that would eventually create agriculture, cities, writing, and everything we call civilization. The loss of Doggerland was real and devastating, but it wasn't the end. It was a transformation, painful, traumatic, but ultimately survivable. If human civilization manages to navigate the challenges of climate change, and that's a significant if at this point, we might look back on our current era the way we now look back on the drowning of Doggerland. A time of dramatic environmental change, of displacement and adaptation, of old ways of life ending and new ones beginning. The communities that exist today in low-lying coastal areas may have to relocate just as the Doggerlanders did. The geography we take for granted may be transformed by rising seas, just as the geography of Mesolithic Europe was transformed. But humans are remarkably adaptable, and we've survived catastrophic changes before. The sea remembers Doggerland even if we forgot it for millennia. The bones and tools and sediment layers preserve a record of what was lost, waiting patiently for anyone curious enough to look. And now that we've looked, now that we've reconstructed this vanished world and populated it with real people and real stories, we can't claim ignorance. We know what happens when sea levels rise dramatically. We know what happens when communities fail to adapt to changing conditions. We know what happens when paradise drowns. What we do with that knowledge is up to us. The Dogger Bank still rises from the floor of the North Sea, a shallow area that gives fishermen good catches and archaeologists tantalizing glimpses of a lost world. Somewhere beneath those waters lie the remains of communities, the artifacts of daily life, perhaps even the bones of people who never imagined their homeland would become a seafloor. They lived and loved and died in a world that no longer exists, and we are only beginning to understand who they were. But their story isn't just about the past. It's about the future, our future, the one we're creating right now with every choice we make about energy and emissions and development. The ghosts of Doggerland have a message for us, if we're willing to listen. The sea is patient. The sea is rising, and the sea always wins in the end. Whether we heed that warning, whether we choose to learn from a catastrophe that happened 8,000 years ago and apply those lessons to our own time, that's the question that matters now. Doggerland is gone, but we're still here, still capable of charting a different course if we find the wisdom and the will. The people who watched their world drown didn't have that option. We do. So the next time you look at a map and see the North Sea, remember that there's more beneath those waters than fish and shipping lanes and oil platforms. There's a lost world, a drowned paradise, a reminder that geography isn't permanent, and that the coastlines we know are just the current frame in a very long movie. Doggerland existed for thousands of years, supported thriving human communities, and vanished so completely that we forgot it had ever been there. It took modern science to bring it back, and modern wisdom will determine whether its story becomes our story too. Thanks for watching. If this journey through the lost world of Doggerland opened your eyes to something you didn't know before, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment about what surprised you most. History isn't just about kings and battles and dates in textbooks. It's about real people living through real changes, and sometimes those changes reshape the entire world. Until next time, stay curious.